So we're here today to talk about lessons learned from the gallery, episode 2, Heart of the Emberstone, or I've changed it to Fear and Loathing in VR. I'm Denny Younger, the CEO and creative director at Cloudhead Games. So Cloudhead Games was founded in 2013. We're a strictly VR-focused studio. We're based on Vancouver Island. We have a sister studio as well in Vancouver proper. Pretty small team. We're 15 people, kind of scale up to 20 people depending on the project. So you might know us from 2 experiences. One was Call of the Starseed, which was actually a bundled title with the HTC Vive, and Heart of the Emberstone, which came out 18 months later. They both did pretty well on market. Episode 1 did critically well. It did well with fans. Same thing with episode 2. Yeah, we were pretty happy with how they did. Kind of Goonies-esque 80s adventure puzzle-solving type experiences. So just some quick history. I don't know if my videos will work here. I'm on a tethered phone, but wow, look at that. Anyways, Cloudhead innovated with hand interaction in early 2013. This is before there was really any kind of surrogate controls for hand interaction in VR. So, man, the buffering is brutal. Anyways, so we were using Razer Hydra at the time because there was really nothing else on market. And that was originally developed by 6 Sense. But we built a bunch of hand interaction systems. You know, it was the first time really that anybody had thought about, you know, how do you interact with an object in VR? And we had this kind of very lofty, maybe slightly ignorant view that we were going to build a fully standing up VR experience where you use your hands and you were fully embodied in that experience. So we just kind of bored forward, even though there was no certainty that any one of the VR companies would be giving us any kind of hand interaction. In 2014, we did something called Snap Turns, or VR Comfort Mode. Kind of the big elephant in the room at that time was, well, what happens when you're seated in an experience and you're doing some kind of artificial velocity or rotation? Well, that makes people sick. So we ended up devising the system that got around it by, we started thinking about how dancers would kind of spin, ballerinas would spin and spot in the distance. And we're like, how do we emulate that in software so that they're always kind of looking at a fixed point in space? So Snap Turns evolved from that and ended up solving some really kind of key vestibular disconnect issues, and ended up being adopted by the industry and eventually included in Oculus's best practice guide. In 2015, a very long story short, Valve invited us to a secret summit where they were showcasing the first beginnings of room scale technology with 10 other developers or so. And at that point, we had to figure out systems that would support some kind of teleportation system. So taking your volume of existing space, figuring out, well, what if a user only has the room in front of their computer, or maybe they have a carpet in front of their TV, or maybe they have a whole garage that they can actually run around in. So how do we build systems to support that? How do we show where the boundaries are? How do we show them where the center of their room is? What happens when a user approaches a virtual wall in space and sticks their head through the wall because they want to see the treasure chest? What's the reset mechanism for that? So we built a number of those compounding systems, and again, they were broadly adopted by the industry. In 2016, what's cool about this, we did, for both projects, inside-out VR motion capture. So the best example I can give is, James Cameron for Avatar. He had his little virtual monitor, and he could see the actors performing in his virtual world, but they couldn't see anything. They just had to look like idiots in their suits and dance around, and they had to use their imagination broadly. So we thought about inverting that process and letting actors see the virtual environment that they were acting towards while we were capturing performance data. Sorry about the buffering. So what the consequence of that was, we got some really compelling performances because the actors actually had context for what they were experiencing in VR. And it turned out great. And so 2 examples that have kind of used this thusly is Game of Thrones actually used it on set for their extras and capturing data. And more recently, Ready Player One did it. So where to begin? I really struggled with this talk because over the last 5 years, I could condense everything down to 1 or 2 systems and give you guys our noble attempts to solve some kind of innovation. But I think it's more important that I talk to you about the current state of the industry and how you as a VR studio, if that's what you're doing, are going to survive until we reach a crucial inflection point. So I want to start with this. VR is dead and it will kill you. So more often than not, when you crack open your favorite website, you'll see something like this. So in the trades, you'll see titles, some variation on this theme. You know, VR isn't doing well, it sucks, it's dead, it made me sick. I don't blame the press for this. I think that they're driven by click-throughs, so they have to hype up whatever gets clicks. So more often than not, that's where they go. So I'm going to relate this to the Gartner hype cycle. And many of you have probably already seen this in some variation. So this has to do with any new technology and it's usually the really good ones. They go through this hype cycle of the peak of inflated expectations and then down to the trough of disillusionment. And then they kind of slowly ride up that curve back to the plateau of productivity. And this is based on kind of visibility across time. So Call of Starseed, our first episode, launched kind of at the peak of the inflated expectations market. And because of that, we got amazing press, we got bundle opportunities, and everybody is really fixated on this amazing new technology of VR. And the title itself did really well on market because of that. I've listed AR here and I put it pretty far down on the inflated expectation cycle because AR was like the saving grace for most investors, and they're like, yeah, it's going to be the next big thing. And I think you're just starting to see it tip over the edge of that inflated expectation cycle to a point where they're like, oh, there's actually a lot of problems to be solved in terms of form factor and systems to make this palatable to mass consumer consumption. So from that perspective, I think VR is actually doing much better. Anyways, Call of Starseed did quite well when things first launched. Around 18 months later, we launched Heart of the Emberstone in October 2017. And it performed really well in terms of critical success and customer reaction, much like Call of the Starseed did, but we got zero press coverage. We got trade industry coverage, and what I mean by that is VR-specific coverage. But the mainstream press completely ignored us. And flat out, we talked to many of them, and they're just like, yeah, we're just not getting clicks for VR, so we're not covering it. So unless you're doing a AAA title, you're just not going to get any coverage. And it really hurt us quite a bit. So when we finished Call of the Starseed, we did what every game developer does. We looked at the amount our game sucks. So we looked at that ratio of 70% of users said, your game doesn't suck. And we just ignored that because that's what game devs do. And then we went down and drilled down into the things that we wanted to know, which was 2% of users said it was too easy, but it doesn't suck. 3% said, I want stick move, therefore it sucks. 15% said, your game is great, but too short, therefore it sucks. 5% said, doesn't suck, but too short. 5% said, your game generally just sucks. So we took that to heart, and that's why there was an 18-month dev cycle behind this. And we made the game bigger and better in almost every way. So we enhanced systems, we made interactions more complex. It was a non-linear story. We had a bunch of cyclical areas of the game that you could visit. And it was just generally a more complex experience and a much bigger experience. And budget and time inflated because of that. And it did well, it's just we didn't get any press. So as a studio, Cloudhead Games sees the inflection point for VR coming in around 2020. There's a lot of reasons for this, and I'm going to try to go through these with you right now. So you've probably already seen this quite a bit in market, but we're seeing general hardware improvements to every kind of critical factor that the public was critical of. You're seeing resolution improvements, you're seeing untethered headsets, you're seeing form factor improvements, you're seeing a very broad list of improvements that address kind of key public concerns about VR as a technology. You're also seeing hardware competition coming to market, and from all of our relationships in market currently, we see billions being invested into new hardware but following kind of this high-end VR spectrum. So, fully tracked controllers, a 6-DoF experience where you can move around in the experience. That is all going to drive down price points over the next 2 years and just drive a more competitive market. And again, I can't emphasize how much money is being dumped into this from all partners. There are some software investments happening. Typically, these are only going to a handful of AAA developers. So you'll get like this little bucket of AAA experiences. Probably not enough being done there, but those will help drive additional sales. Last but not least, location-based entertainment. Many of you probably heard of LBEs or the promise of them. There are, again, billions of dollars being poured into Asian markets for this, but more interestingly, in North America, there's strong investments happening here too. So I'm a kid from the 80s. My first experience with games was walking into an arcade, and that's where I got to play Gauntlet for the first time. That's where I saw all these amazing games. And I couldn't get that at home. I could not get that experience at home. And it's a big problem with VR for just the general masses. They haven't had that high-end VR experience. So arcades are really a portal to having that experience. And with such broad investments happening there, I really think that's going to pivot and turn the market over the next 2 years. So where does that leave us? So the mainstream press is not seeing traffic. So they're kind of ignoring your title. Don't rely on them. Just don't. If you're a game developer and you're doing VR, you can't stick your focus there. You really have to rely on other mechanisms to prop up your game. Focus on VR trades and VR-specific media and partner relationships. Ecosystem support is very conservative. What I mean by that is there's not a ton of money being poured in by hardware manufacturers. They are doing some investments, but this was more prominent in the first part of the cycle, the peak of expectations. A lot of money was pouring in. Now what you're seeing is more kind of focused, calibrated relationships with AAA developers. So if you're looking for money specifically from ecosystem partners, it's going to be a challenge. Investors are obsessed with AR. I think we're starting to come off the curve of that, but they're still obsessed. You're generally not going to get investment from investors. And they're always obsessed with blockchain. All I see in my Twitter feed is blockchain, blockchain, blockchain. Consumers have very limited access to hardware, either by, they just can't afford it, or they live in a geographic location that doesn't permit seeing that hardware. And the final thing is the current market only supports limited scale projects. So you're looking at pretty tight budgets and small teams. Solutions. So this is what I want to be the takeaway for you guys here today. I'm sharing a bit of our internal deck here. I've masked some of the things. But we have kind of a two-pronged strategy at our studio to deal with where the market is currently. On the left, you're going to see kind of nimble trend development, and on the right, you're going to see future-facing development. So we're fixating on what projects can be turned around at a very limited budget and with small teams, and what those projects are, and more importantly, how deeply they support platform. And then on the right, you're seeing future-facing development. So these are much broader, bigger projects with better prospects for when the market can actually support those titles. So drilling down into that specifically, you're going to want to focus on very deep platform support. You want to be fixating on Vive, Oculus, Windows MR, any future, and PSVR obviously, but any future platform that really capitalizes on high-end VR experiences. Track controllers, 6-DoF, room scale. You want your project to work with location-based amusements, and because this is really going to be one of the factors that drives general consumer adoption. So whatever you're working on right now, figure out an angle so that it fits in an arcade. How can a person have a 10, 15-minute experience, or a family? You want to have small teams, 15 to 20-person teams. You want to be nimble. You want to be small. Projects need to fit within like a $500K to $1 million range to get a meaningful return for your company. Who's going to be funding this? Well, you are, primarily. You can go to publishers. There is some light interest there, and they will put money in. Manufacturer support, again, you can go to Oculus, you can go to Vive, you can go to PSVR, you can start those relationships, really important. But both of them are going to require smart money. So you can go to them, but more often than not, they won't greenlight a project unless it already has other money in. So you're kind of in a catch-22 chicken before the egg situation there. Avoid investors unless you're selling tools. This is a pretty broad statement, but we've been dealing with the investor landscape for 5 years, and more often than not, they're just kind of kicking tires to see where your company sits in the market, or they don't have market sensitivities, they don't have enough information on market, and a lot of times they're really just wasting your time. And as a small studio, likely you can't afford to waste your time. So I would suggest avoiding investors unless they are seriously fixated and focused on the VR market, and or if you're selling tools. Hollywood, we've had a really interesting cycle with Hollywood. The best advice I can give you is ask a lot of really important focused questions up front before you get into pitching. So put budget securities up in front of those conversations. They want you to do a job for, I don't know what, the latest Tomb Raider movie. Ask them what their budget is. And if they say, oh, I don't know, then shut the door and walk away. Some Hollywood studios will have money, and they will have a marketing budget. And some of them are more forward-thinking than others, so you can't just completely say, go away. But you want to secure the tough questions up front before you get into a pitching process. And eat dev cycles. You're going to be pulling your designers off. You're going to be pulling your BD people off to work on whatever that big pitch is. So I would just caution you to be really careful with Hollywood. And maybe they'll pay to pitch. Some of them do. Tertiary manufacturer support and promotion. A lot of times, manufacturers won't kick in money, although sometimes they will, depending on project. But you're really going to want to apply those relationships for promotion. That's where you're going to get the most leverage on market. So, Steam VR and HTC and Oculus and PSVR, build those relationships, but fixate and kind of align yourself on the promotion front, because that's probably where you'll get the most traction on launching your title. Again, fixate on VR trade coverage. So you're gonna want to think about the core VR trade coverage rather than the mainstream coverage, because they will simply tell you no. And plan for the future. Don't let these kind of short-term contingencies drive what your future product will be, because you probably have more ambitious ideas about where VR is going, and you do want to invest and think about that, but do so responsibly. So here's some changes that we'd like to see. These probably won't happen, but this is some stuff that I think the industry should be doing. I would really love to see manufacturers educate, invest, and curate the mainstream press. Some of this happened when the hardware first launched. So you saw some hardware going out and some titles being sent out along with that hardware to the mainstream press. And they got kind of a good curated, oh, this is what good VR is experience. I think we've lost some of that as we spiraled down to the bottom of the curve. I think it's really important to boost that up again and invest more resources in injecting hardware and a short list of curated experiences so the press has some measure of balance so that they understand what they're actually reviewing. Because more often than not, the mainstream press has no context for what a good VR experience is. So often they will promote something that just isn't good. Stop being so precious with hardware. I would love to see Oculus or Vive stick headsets in McDonald's. And I would love to see those headsets get broken repeatedly. They should be in play spaces. They should be accessible to the public. There's a huge problem. When I walk into Best Buy, for example, I see a whole row of VR headsets, and all of them are based on some variation of Google Cardboard. It's a low-end kind of 3DOF experience. And for many consumers, they spend $20, they put on the headset, they have a shitty app that's included, and they go, oh, that was a gimmick that I'll never do again. So I think we have to be more aggressive as an industry of placing high-end hardware in visible places. And stop worrying about whether or not it's going to break. Invest some money, let the shit break, or build more well-rounded, robust systems that can handle some abuse from children. I would also like to have a deeper conversation around hardware and software balance. What I mean by that is there's billions of dollars being poured into hardware manufacturing from a number of interests, but on balance, there is a fractional proportion being invested into software. I have a little chart here to explain that a bit more. So what consumers typically see is a small handful of AAA titles on market, a very broad palette of shovelware, and these are low-risk basement quality productions. Sometimes they're repeating themes, they're clones of games, and the consumer experience from that is very unbalanced. And then you have a swath of middle-tier developers and innovators, really putting in the resources to try something different and unique, and often they aren't adequately supported. And the reason I want to put a point of focus on this is because I think you'll get more out of investments in middle-tier development than you will out of a small grouping of AAA titles on market. There's much more value there than there is just doing 3 titles a year. So market sensitivity. This will never happen, but I'm throwing it up as a point anyways. It would be great if all hardware manufacturers on their platforms, on Oculus Home, on Steam VR, on Sony's storefront, if they did a temporary moratorium or reduction on revenue share. I think this would actually signal a weakness in market, but I think it would drive new developers into the space. I think people would be willing to take more risks, and it would stimulate the middle tier of development. So we're going to have to work a lot harder to figure out what those answers are, because I don't think it's going to be that, but I'm going to say it anyways. So that's it. It's not all doom and gloom. I actually have really high prospects and hopes for VR. I still believe that it is a world-changing technology, and we are on the upcycle of that curve. And there is just so much opportunity in that space. And I would encourage you to develop there, because if you can hold out till 2020, if you can find where that sweet spot is in the current market, I think you're going to do really well once you move past 2020. That's it. Anybody have questions? Thanks.
Hi. I really enjoyed your narrative. It was right to the point. I just have one question about the cardboard applications, which I will also agree with you. It's like the majority of the apps I have experienced so far. In your opinion, would you consider this as a bad example that should be probably taken out, like mobile VR just should be just taken away and stick into AR? Or do you think there is a goal or a purpose that they could fulfill?
Yeah, there's a place for mobile VR. There's a place for 3DOT VR even. I used it on the plane. I watched movies on the way down here, right? I just think that because it's more accessible, it's cheaper, all those good things, that's the common experience. So that's it's great, but it also worries me about what the first point of contact is with VR for most consumers, right? But there's some amazing 360 videos, there's some amazing documentary stuff on mobile platforms that are completely valid. It's just, we need to balance that out somehow.
It's a pretty hard decision, but I get your point.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Nicole Lazaro from Zio Design, Zio Play, doing Follow the White Rabbit. I was curious, you talked a little bit about the future, what hardware manufacturers can do to kind of stimulate the market or get us out of the trough. On the content side, we have a room full of mostly developers, I think. What do you think we can do on the in terms of development to help us get better experiences? Because I kind of believe that if we have more fun, people have more fun in VR, we're going to drive adoption that way.
Yeah, that's the tricky nut, right? Again, as a studio, we're focusing on really short turnaround projects, but fun is kind of at the peak of that whole ladder. They have to be fun, but accessible and easy to understand within 10, 15 minutes. And they have to be broadly supported, and they have to work in LBEs, because that's the big push that's happening over the next 2 years. But those things are actually what is going to help drive the tipping point. So it's a noble effort.
So do you have any specific, what kind of content you think will work really well in this next phase?
Sure, yeah. Multiplayer for sure. It has to be highly social, easily accessible, and what I mean by that is just 5 minutes. The interaction landscape for that has to be very simple. So you want to be able to build something that your mom can play and your 8-year-old can play, right? which is pretty broad, but you can start thinking about what scenarios make that workable.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, Oded, I'm an indie VR dev. I'm actually working on a game that my mom and my 9-year-old can play.
Perfect.
I had a discussion with somebody yesterday who said one of the reasons there's no like mass adoption of VR is there a lack of a killer app. And I was trying to think, or is there like a killer app? And I want to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, and lots of people have asked the same question, and lots of people have kind of the same answer, I think. And I don't think it's any one application. I think that's the misnomer. There's no such thing. I think the application is a bunch of pretty major corporate interests trying to build the metaverse. And whoever does that successfully first is going to really stimulate broad adoption for VR. And they're doing it right now. Everybody's working towards that same thing, and they're all going to have a big fight over who owns the metaverse. Once all of these applications are accessible under a common infrastructure, and you can share it with your mom, and I can share it with my gaming buddies, and it all works as one cohesive whole, that's the killer app. It's not one thing. Well, it kind of is, but it's a big thing. It's a big one thing.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hey, what's up, Danny? How's it going,
Hey.
dude? On the list, do you feel that doing cross-platform is something that should be pretty important or emphasized? Or if you're a small dev team or just a few folks, just maybe focus on one, because that could be a challenge going even between Rift 5 and PlayStation VR.
Yeah, so what we've found anyways is that going into new projects, we had to focus on PSVR as kind of the bottom floor in terms of performance and how much we could squeeze out of the system. If you can, if you're starting a new project, start there, because that extrapolates up to all the other platforms very easily. Like once you've done PSVR, going up is way easier. So it doesn't take a lot of dev cycles to get broad platform support as long as you're starting at the bottom. Yeah. Thanks. I think that's it, pretty much. Yeah. Okay, thanks you guys. Appreciate it.